an afterlife, and we're there, does personal consciousness survive? You know, like if there's an afterlife and I'm there, whether in heaven or hell, will I know I'm Marcus and that I used to live in Oregon, taught at Oregon State, and cheered for the Beavers and so forth? And if personal consciousness survives, is that an inferior or superior state of affairs? Like if personal consciousness survives, does that mean that after death there are reunions with people we've known in this life? Family reunions? And if so, is that good news or bad news? You're very serious about that. Because for many people, family has been the primary source of pain in their life. I don't need to go on and on about the reasons why I say, I don't have a clue what happens after death. And then I will affirm this. I'm persuaded, I believe, if you will, that when we die, we do not die into nothingness, but we die into God. But what more that might mean, I have no idea. And it does not bother me in the least that I have no idea. Martin Luther had a great line about this. He said, the afterlife is God's business. I don't have to worry about that. That's called living one's life with trust. And I think trust is one of the central meanings of the word faith. Anxiety, fear, etc. being the opposite, or at least one of its opposites. Could be reincarnation. I mean, who knows? Okay.
Yes, Dr. Marcus Borg, you had mentioned just a few minutes ago about all Christians make decisions about which texts to believe in Scripture and such. What in you compels you as a definitive guide about truth to not believe that your takes on which texts are true or not are not simply a reflection of a popular cultural expectation of what is good?
Well, a couple things. I try to provide reasons for hearing a text one way or another. And I have done that publicly in the sense of, you know, being part of large, no, that's not the best way to put it, being part of professional academic societies where, you know, your argument has to make sense to some of your peers, or you kind of realize I'm on my own idiosyncratic hobby horse here. I think more broadly, the test of whether or not a given interpretation of a text, that is, whether to hear it metaphorically or literally, or to hear it as testimony of the early Christian community, or it's going back to Jesus and so forth. I think in some ways, the test for whether you're making any sense is how much sense it makes to other people. So it's not just, you know, I like this, I don't like that. I've got to make sense to the people I'm talking to.
Can I clarify my question a little bit then?
Yeah.
So for instance then, possibly you may run into a tribe in Papua New Guinea or some other place. And I think in general, most places around the world, there are certainly many of them. If you ran into a tribe or a group, for instance, if you're in the Middle East also, the average person you ran into, if you were to ask him, is it possible that there's one true religion? They would many times answer, yes, this is perfectly acceptable then. But you just said, you know, for instance, it should make sense to other people. Sure. But it makes plenty of sense to them that there's one true religion. So, for instance, does that...
Yeah, and you know, the notion that there's one true religion, And of course, some religions have really never affirmed that, at least at the official level. Like Buddhism has never said that, Hinduism. But you're quite right. People who practice a particular religion and who really don't know anything about other religions or other ways of putting the world together are likely to say that. It's part of the provinciality of human experience, which is why many of our ancestors 2 or 3 generations back could not only easily believe that Christianity is the only true religion, but they didn't use it in a highly aggressive, judgmental way. It was what they knew. So there's a kind of innocent way of saying, well, of course this is the right way. And so I don't know how completely that is a response, but yes.
I believe, Marcus, that religion has much to do with consensus. That is, people must agree in some way on a set of doctrines or beliefs, truths, if you will, not necessarily with a capital T, but religion, and in particular Christianity, does not originate from or with a consensus. It originates with God, who reveals himself irrespective of people's situation or upbringing. He reveals himself because he wants to, because he would. And the only consensus involved in this decision to reveal himself is within the Trinity, the Godhead himself.
If I may quickly piggyback on that, there are always receivers of revelation. There's not just a revealer, there's a receiver.
Mm-hmm.
And how the receiver understands the revelation will, to some extent, be the product of their time and place, what they're familiar with, their words, etc., etc. So I don't think there is any such thing as pure revelation.
Mm. Again, that's where we differ. And we also differ in that God's revelation may call for application and for particularization from age to age and from culture to culture, as this young man here suggested. But he is still able and quite able to reveal himself, to get his point across, to say what he is up to, what he wants to say. God is able to communicate that.
Right. Next question.
Dr. Emmrich, in his opening speech, stated that we are at war with God. He also stated that death is not natural and a punishment. And Dr. Marcus stated that he would rather see him as a loving God. In the Bible, often death means hell for those who don't believe. And in this, do you believe that this is a threat and that it is a fear tactic? Or what, I guess? Has modern Christianity changed something in the Bible to be more of a way to convince people rather than the truth?
Well, I think it is both, if I may begin here. It is a warning. Warnings are teethless if they do not also instill some sort of fear that moves people in a certain direction. So it is that, but it is also a way of convincing people. It is a way of reasoning with people. After all, ordinarily we don't enter this world and then drop dead. We are given time to observe, to study, to understand, and this time is the time in which God in which we can encounter God, in which God can speak to us. And death, the presence of death, the universality of it, certainly is a means of doing so.
For me, any form of Christianity that uses the threat of hell as a motivation for being Christian or as the sanction for not being Christian creates fear-based Christianity. And I think the great figures of the tradition maybe not all of them, but most of the ones we talk about and revere, were deeply convinced that God is gracious. To cite the spiritual mentor of my own childhood, Martin Luther, I grew up Lutheran, Luther's conversion, if you will, and of course it was a conversion within Christianity, was from the fear-based God whom he was convinced would send him to hell because of his unrighteousness, to an experience of radical, overwhelming grace. And please don't misunderstand my position. I think there are consequences for human actions, but I don't see any of those as divine punishments. And I'm talking about consequences for human actions in this life. If you remain in a state of blindness, you remain in a state of blindness. If you are full of self-destructive behaviors, you will eventually self-destruct. You jump off a building, don't blame God for making the pavement come up and hit you, okay? So, of course, there are consequences for individuals and societies for repeated injustice and foolishness and blindness and all of that. But I think that's real different from talking about the threat of hell as something that we need to deal with by being in the right religion or believing the right things or whatever.
But it's also different from Luther, who even after his conversion and discovery of the God of love, continued to preach about divine retribution.
Yep, he had warts. He's right. He's right about that. I still think his conversion was from the punitive God who created fear within him to a God of grace.
All right. I'm sorry to say we just have time for one more question.
Okay, my question is for you, Mr. Borg. In your opening speech, you said that Jesus wasn't the only way to salvation.
Yeah.
So what other ways are there to salvation? Because I feel that the Bible clearly states that there's one way and you can only go that way.
Okay. There are only 2 verses in the New Testament that say that.
That's enough for me.
Okay, but I'm just saying. That's fair enough. I just wanted to make the point. It's not that it's all over the place. Okay. 2 comments. First, I don't think salvation is primarily about an afterlife.
I think there's more to it than that too. But
Yeah, and you know, I haven't quantified them, but if I'm pretty sure that if you look up all the uses of salvation in the Bible, maybe 5 or 10% of them have to do with an afterlife, and the rest are about transformation in this life. So my synonym for salvation would really be transformation. And then the question becomes, is Jesus the only way of transformation? And, you know, for any of you who know a devout Buddhist or Muslim or whatever well, you kind of know that these people are also involved in a process of transformation that comes from their being trying to open themselves to the working of the Spirit and trying to grow in compassion and so forth. So, let me put it this way. I don't think Jesus is the only way to heaven. I don't think the purpose of religions, properly speaking, is about getting to heaven. No denial of an afterlife in there, just I don't think that's the emphasis. But the purpose of religions is to be means of ultimate transformation. And that's what I think salvation in the Bible is most often about.
Well, there's a Beatles song that was recorded in 1967. It's called You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. And the reason why I refer to this is because any human being who has some level of consciousness as to who he or she is also knows where he or she lives. And I would maintain that just as we are particular, so is God. Not all ways lead to God. not every revelation